shortly. My name is Justin Frontier. I am the director of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. This is one of 4 agencies that are co-hosting this year's Healing Journeys Conference. The others being the Gatehouse, Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness, also known as Abuse Hurts, and then Lynn McDonnell and Associates. Lynn is a psychotherapist that does a lot of work with male victims of trauma. So you'll hear from representatives of those other agencies over the course of the day, and one in particular will be joining me shortly. Let me just say it's been, some of you may know, a bit of a challenge putting this conference together. This conference is fairly unique. This is something new. That makes it inherently a challenge. In addition, we had to relocate to U of T. I hope nobody's complaining. I think we've got a pretty good venue here. But I do again apologize for that last minute change, which was necessitated by the strike, which I understand is still going pretty strong there at Humber College. So this is a unique event. I think the fact that you're all here, despite the last minute change, despite the weather, shows that this is a very important topic, and I'm sure you all really agree with me on that. So thanks for sticking to it, and thanks for your flexibility and being here today. This is a conference that looks at the intersection of men, trauma, and mental health. And again, I think that's fairly unique. We also look at all forms of trauma. We look at men as survivors of domestic abuse, sexual abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, and then the mental health consequences, PTSD and other kinds of mental health consequences, which we'll get into today. I don't need to tell you the rates of male victimization of all forms of abuse are quite high. In some quarters, this may be unacknowledged, unappreciated, but nonetheless, it's true. If we look at sexual abuse, we have the stat 1 in 6 men are survivors of childhood sex abuse. When it comes to domestic violence against men, I know some of the numbers are a little bit contested, but if we look at the Statistics Canada data in any event, we know that there are potentially as many as 400,000 men across Canada, at least in the last survey in 2009, the so-called family violence portrait that was done by Stats Can, 400,000 men who are victims of domestic violence. So those are the numbers. We also know how they affect real families. The work that we do, we see a lot of these families. We do a lot of frontline work in terms of providing legal support and counseling. And I can tell you, and in fact, you will hear stories from these men who are dealing with domestic abuse. We've had men who, one case that really stands out for me, a father who had a young son, and he didn't know where to go. There aren't a lot of services for male domestic abuse victims. He at one point was actually having to hide out in his own basement with his son and locking the door at night in order to protect him and his son. You'll hear lots of very moving stories about that. And the idea here today is to find solutions. We're about finding positive solutions, not about casting blame or complaining about the situation, but about trying to make things better for these families. So I want to thank you again for being here. And at this point, Madison, you're right there, from the Gatehouse is going to say a few words from that co-hosting organization.
The facilitators at the Gatehouse, the Adult Men Support Group. As Justin was explaining, the Gatehouse is a co-sponsor of the event, and we're very happy to be in that capacity. Just to tell you a bit about the Gatehouse, it is primarily a place that supports adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse in a peer support group format. There's also a child-friendly environment in which interviews can take place for individuals and families if there's suspected child abuse. In addition to the group peer support and the interview room that's available, there's also a referral and connections with other agencies in the city that the Gatehouse can help with. There's the phase 1 group, phase 2 group that takes place. One is 15 weeks, the other is 16 weeks. It's gender exclusive, so male only for phase 1, and then it's co-ed in phase 2. There's also art therapy groups, one-on-one peer support, and a partner support workshop that brings together partners and survivors together just to educate them and support them as much as possible. Yeah, that's what I have to say about the Gatehouse. Thank you.
So again, thanks so much for joining us. Just a few quick words about the Centre for Men and Families, where I hail from. So we've been in operations for a few years. We're still, I guess, one of the newer kids on the block. And we do a variety of programs, trying to fill gaps where we identify them. with respect to programs and services for boys, men, fathers, and families. So we do programs around father involvement, trying to promote father-child relationship building. We do legal clinics, we run individual counseling, and then I guess most relevant for today, we have a package of services for male victims of trauma and abuse, and with specific emphasis on domestic abuse. We identified that as a particularly big and significant gap, so we do trauma counseling. We have a support group specifically for all male identified people who have been, who are survivors of domestic violence. And then we have relationships with places like Legal Aid Ontario, Housing Connections, and a number of clinics and hospitals for referrals and partnerships to better support this community. So that's who we are. You'll hear from the other agencies, some of the ones that are here in this room and others that will be on the panel a little bit later this afternoon. We've asked them to share some thoughts, so they each get 5 minutes roughly to talk about their experiences and lessons they've learned and how essentially we can do a better job at improving supports for men and their families. That's the theme of the conference. So 5 minutes each, and then we'll get into a discussion. So we're going to start with Rob and then we'll work our way towards me. So let me do some really quick introductions to each person as we go. So Rob Hawkings is a Toronto-based counselor, psychotherapist, and consultant in private practice, with specialties in addiction and adult resolution of childhood trauma. And there are detailed biographies for everybody in your program. So we'll stop there. Let's go to Rob.
Thanks, Justin. Happy to be here and just amazed and pleased at the turnout. I've been working as a therapist predominantly with men for well over 20 years. And I just want to talk about some of the things I've learned over those 20 years. I started in the field of addictions, very quickly learned that what men wanted to do, they wanted help with the addictions, yes, but a surprising number opened up to me about childhood trauma, particularly sexual abuse. There's a very high percentage of men with all kinds of different addictions who have been sexually abused, and we find it very difficult to talk about. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that comparing men to women in terms of how childhood trauma affects them, the similarities are greater than the differences. They're more alike than different. Trauma affects people in very similar ways, regardless of gender, age, and where they're from. Having said that, there are some important differences. Sexual assault against children or males is perpetrated predominantly by men. And I don't want to discount it. I want to honor how many, particularly perhaps those who are here in this room, work with or are men who've been victimized by women. I certainly work with a lot myself. And men are predominantly the perpetrators of sexual violence. So what does that mean for a man as opposed to a woman, or a boy as opposed to a girl who's victimized by this? It means that he is far more likely to experience confusion about his gender orientation. This is a very, very common issue for men who've been abused. And they can react to that in different ways. Some may explore the gender orientation that they think they have. If they were abused by a man, they may think they're gay, and they may or may not be, but they will explore that, often in some pretty unhealthy ways. Or they may overreact the other way and become hyper-heterosexual, also in some very unhealthy ways. So I very quickly learned that I had to get knowledgeable about working with compulsive sexual behaviors and sexual addiction, and that's another one of my specialties. And there is an extremely high overlap between sexual addiction and having been sexually abused as a child among men. It's in the order of 80 to 90%. The second thing I want to talk about is socialization. Men are brought up buying into a whole bunch of myths which are pretty damaging to them. The myth that men have to be strong, that men can't have feelings except anger. The myth that they can't be victims. And those myths lead them into some pretty dangerous and damaging behavior toward others, and leave them trapped in a pretty difficult place when they become victims themselves through no fault of their own. It's not okay to be a victim if you're brought up to be a man. And that varies from culture to culture, but it's pretty strong in most cultures I've run into. So there's a word that's very often used these days, and I like it. It's called intersectionality. It's about the intersection between, for example, being sexually victimized and gender. And that's what I've been talking about. It's also about the interaction between being sexually victimized and culture, right? Or skin color. And those things need to be taken into account. I volunteered for many years with an organization called Male Survivor, based in the States, and we did weekends of recovery for men who had been sexually abused. We were invited up to do 2 up north, and we had Indigenous people there, First Nations people, and we discovered some things, some blinders that we had on. We discovered that through offering these weekends to predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly white, upper middle class men, we were kind of ignorant about some things that we needed to know about native culture. We didn't understand the role of elders. We didn't understand the role of tradition and ceremony. I was privileged in another project I was involved with to work with a man some of you may know, Elder Little Brown Bear, also known as Ernest Marteau, who was working at that time at the Enotic Healing Lodge in Victoria Harbour. And we both knew each other from Bellwood Health Services, where I worked for 5 years, an addiction treatment facility. And Ernest Enotic was working with men who had been sexually abused. He and I had that common interest. And he told me that those men would not talk about what they had experienced for a long, long time. And the only way he could begin to connect with them was by organizing a drumming circle and starting to teach them their culture, drumming. And after maybe a year of that, they started to open up about what had been done to them and how it had affected them. So that's an example of intersectionality. So I welcome opportunities wherever I can find them to work with people of different cultures, different traditions, and This is the important piece, to co-create with them the healing experiences and the approaches to healing and recovery that are going to work for them. I can't bring what I've learned in my privileged white culture and import it and expect it to work with people who don't relate to those traditions and who have other layers of victimization and traumatization that they must deal with at the same time. So, by the way, anybody who's interested in those weekends of recovery, that program has now changed its affiliation from Male Survivor to Helping Men Heal, which is a more diverse organization than Male Survivor was. And information on those can be found at www.helpingmenheal.org. And just do a search within that website for days and weekends of recovery. So I think I've spoken for well over my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
But it was well used. Thanks, Rob.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. As Justin said, I've been working for the Meta Center, which is a developmental services organization agency in Toronto, providing services for people with developmental disabilities. I work in their support independent living program, so I support those who live on their own, who need extra support. And within the developmental sector, especially for survivors of institutions, there is much higher than average instances of both sexual, physical, and mental abuse. Most recently, that has been recognized with two lawsuits towards the Canadian government, the Heronia Institute and now the Ecker Institute. I have worked with some of the survivors of those institutes. It's when you look at people who have been in institutions since they were 2 and 3 years old, and then they come out of those institutions when they're in their 30s and 40s. There is a lot of trauma associated with that. In my informal contact with those clients, I've helped them work through some of that trauma. We as an agency and with our social worker have supported families through the lawsuit process, and the process of bringing up that trauma is very significant, which goes into my work also in the Community Legal Centre. So I have, after 20 years, 15 years of working in the field, I've gone back to school to get my Master's of Social Work, and as part of my schooling, I've been placed at the Northumberland Community Legal Centre. Now, the Community Legal Centres, there's about 76 centres in Ontario, and they provide poverty support and legal support and advocacy for people with low income. Some of the areas that they provide is income support, denials and appeals, landlord and tenant act issues supporting tenants, human rights issues. One of the things they do pertinent to this workshop is giving out legal aid certificates for domestic violence. They do the interviews and provide the certificates. Unfortunately, they do not provide family law. So that has to find a family lawyer that accepts those certificates. Elder law and tax appeals, and in particular, criminal injury compensation board applications. Within Ontario, if you have been a victim of a crime in Ontario, you are able to ask for compensation, and that's really been beneficial for a lot of victims of crime. The amount of compensation varies anywhere from $5,000 to a total of $25,000 is the maximum limit. We support them from the application to supporting them at the board, the adjudicator. I've myself have provided support, and the one thing that I feel is very significant is when the victim is in front of the board. The monetary is one issue, but being validated that they have been victimized, and that people recognize that they have been victimized, and they feel validated, and it's part of their healing process with them. I've spoken to people while filling out the applications. I've spoken to people after they have been in front of the board, and for some people, the monetary amount is secondary. That I've been able to tell my story, and my story has been validated. So that's really the work that I've been doing. Just for information, the Community Legal Education Ontario provides a good website that provides information on all legal matters. But if you have a question about anything legal that you can go to, it's called stepstojustice.ca, and it presents legal stuff in a way that a lay person, a person who is not familiar with the law, can understand it. And I've found since I've been working in the legal clinics, or legal clinic, that's been very beneficial for myself and for people who just have questions about where can I go, what can I do if I have this legal matter. I think that's my time.
Thank you, Edward. Moving on, he's a volunteer counselor at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, has also worked as a counselor for a number of other agencies in the community, and she supports the company's men dealing with physical and emotional abuse, trauma, and mental health challenges. Gabriela.
I'm going to take my glasses off because it helps me to see blurry. It's easier. So I need something written to my phone. Sorry about that. I'm originally from a city in the north of Mexico, Monterrey. I worked there as a counselor for men that were traveling from Central America on their way to the United States. So that was my previous experience working with men. And now at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. My experience as a counselor in Canada has been limited, but I think that I've learned some important things about issues that men experience that are or can be invisible to many because of the privilege men have in society. For having advantages in many areas, when men are in a position of vulnerability, they are sometimes treated as if their concerns are not important or serious. And examples of this, and this has been like in the conversations I've had with the men I work with, they've told me that sometimes they've been denied sexual assault victim services and parenting support services as single fathers. So sometimes in their search for support, not necessarily professional support, but friends and family, they've encountered responses like, man up and deal with it yourself, you're a grown man. And so this makes it even harder for them to feel safe enough to talk about their experiences. So, as a woman, I wasn't aware of some of the dominant discourses that men are exposed to, and as a Mexican who didn't grow up in Canada, I still have a lot to learn about the culture and subcultures of this city. But from my point of view, and it's important and necessary to acknowledge my limitations and biases in order to avoid replicating these discourses that have been problematic for the clients I meet. I really appreciated what was said about recognizing we were pretty ignorant. I think this has been really important for me. So I'm sure you have an idea of what these discourses are, especially men, and some have been said already in this panel, but some examples are men can be victims of sexual or physical violence because they are physically stronger than women, or that if they suffer emotional abuse is because they are weak or they're not actually suffering emotional abuse, it's just they're exaggerating. Or children don't need their fathers as much, and as well as fathers don't need their children as much. So considering these ideas and assumptions that men are exposed to, clients have taught me some of the things that are necessary for them to get the support they need. And some of those things that they've shared with me are spreading awareness that men have feelings and problems, which can include domestic violence and sexual assault, providing spaces to express how they feel and what they're going through. And some examples of this were therapy groups and online spaces were also a suggestion. Acknowledging that they can be in situations where they are or feel unsafe. Offering support and information resources to fathers just as it is offered to mothers. For example, addressing information, whether it's courses or pamphlets about child care and child development to fathers too. Another thing that I would like to mention is something that was already said, that it was important to co-create with people the healing process. I feel like I can resonate with that too, and especially when with people from different cultures, and myself being from a different culture, I often find myself asking, are there cultural understandings that I might be missing related to the effects this experience has had in your life? And I've learned a lot from asking that question. Also, respecting their words and understandings. There have been men that have told me, like people or professionals call these sexual assault, but that term doesn't fit with me. So we go with the term that that person feels more comfortable with, and that has been very important for them. They've told me, even in the notes we make together, I've asked, like, okay, so how should we call this? And they tell me, and we write that down, whatever their word is, because that feels safer and more comfortable for them. So that's been my experience. I still have a lot to learn, and hoping to learn a lot from today too, from you.
Thanks, Gabriela. I like that note that you just concluded on. This really is about conversation, and this is a more kind of intimate kind of atmosphere for a conference that you may be useful, but I think the advantage of that is that we can maybe have more of a dialogue. So I'm going to ask just maybe one leading question myself, and then it's going to be open, and I hope we can get into a conversation. So I guess my question is, what would you say are the biggest challenges or impediments to encouraging more men to step forward and get help that they might be, I don't know, embarrassed about, or there might be stigmas that are preventing them from getting that help? And are those different for men than for women? Or are they, in fact, essentially very similar or the same in terms of the lessons from your own work? So, Rob, do you want to start us again?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest impediment is one that's common to men and women, and that's the stigma of needing help with mental or emotional issues. And there are ways in which that's perhaps a little stronger for men. It's most of the time, I think, it's a little less okay for men to ask for help than it is for women, that's for sure. Particularly when it comes to anything to do with emotional feelings. And, you know, many of the core issue for men I work with is very often what I'll call, in a very general way, adverse childhood experiences. But that's not what brings them to me necessarily. They may come to me with relationship difficulties or very commonly addiction difficulties. And this is very often, especially in the area of relationship difficulties, it's often they are working with a big handicap. They have not learned how to talk about feelings. They have not learned how to recognize them in themselves. They haven't learned the words to use to describe them, to communicate them to a partner or to anyone else. And they haven't learned how to manage them. And so, I guess to end what I want to say on a positive note, I find it's very helpful to address that in terms of skills. Right? Men are, you know, the old stereotype, and there's some truth to it, is that men are doers. They like to act and do things and fix things, and they relate very well to this idea of skills. And if I can frame the problems they're dealing with as a matter of learning a new set of skills they didn't learn when they were young, and we go into the reasons why, and it really helps them to understand that it's not their fault they didn't learn these skills. Their healthy, normal development was interfered with in some very big ways. And so we can then go about helping them learn these skills and practice them and try them in real life and learn from their mistakes, learn that it's okay to make mistakes in the process.
I think in particular men are faced with reality versus expectations, and even the societal view of the strong, powerful man, and when the reality is in conflict with what they expect for themselves and what they believe that society expects for them, it's very difficult for them to seek the help, or even to recognize in themselves that that I need that support. I just want to also, with the amount of services that are actually out there, I've been working in Toronto for most of my career. Right now I'm working in a rural area, and the contrast between the resources in metropolitan area and resources in the rural area is quite significant in general. So when there's limited resources, limited services, there just isn't anything for men who are seeking support, and often, for example, there's in Coburg there's two family law lawyers, and speaking to my colleagues, neither one of them accept men. So where do you go? And that's really limited, very limited, because to get resources you have to be able to travel an hour, 2 hours, If you're low income, it's a major issue. With transportation, you can't afford to research and find, or you take what you can get, and sometimes what you get is not what you need.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think that a big issue is the systemic approach we take to punish individuals rather than to teach and to heal or educate them. Like Rob said, I never have understood why we punish people who don't know or who have never learned how to communicate or advocate for themselves or understand the experiences that they've endured. And then also I think a key point to that is meeting the individual where they're at. So in that learning, everyone's going to experience that at a different rate and not have the expectations that that's going to be a linear process. One person's going to move faster than another, or maybe gravitate to another, core skill that is easier at the time. And I think what it is as professionals and even our legal system is supporting them and reinforcing and celebrating those small victories, like the hug at the end of the day. We'll take it. Let's do it. This has been a good day. We got a smile. That's something to move forward with.
Well, just to add to what's already been said, I think in my practice with the men I work with, discussing ideas of masculinity and gender roles has been helpful. Making assumptions visible and renegotiating with them, like, okay, what is it that fits with you and what doesn't about these ideas that you have been exposed to, or and just the fact making them visible goes a long way, and also validating their experience, because many times they've been dismissed, unheard, or judged. So that's a big part too. And another comment that I found, like at the Center for Men and Families, is that men feel safer or feel hope that this place might be helpful because it has the word men in it, and that provides safety for them. It's like, okay, maybe they'll understand there. That's a comment that I've encountered.
Thank you. Really appreciate all the insights. So let's turn it to you. Looking for any, if you want to add your own comments to the theme that we've been talking about, just ask you to make it brief, or if you've got a question, that's fine too. I saw Don.
Quite eloquently about how you deal with those issues when it comes to direct services for clients. I'm wondering, are there ways in which you also try to change the culture that these men are living in? How do you reach out to the community and change some of their mindset? Or do you?
I can respond to that. My initial reaction was, gosh, I don't do much of that at all. But then I thought, and I've done trainings and educational presentations, and I've written some things. But I think perhaps the biggest difference I make is in the work I do with individuals and their families, because that has ripple effects, right? If one man gets better, gets well, and learns not to have to be trapped inside this man box, his family benefits, and that in turn influences other people. And just on a personal note, Don, I have 2 children, and I'm a survivor of sexual abuse myself. And if I had not started healing, if I had not gone on a healing journey myself, I would not be able to be the father to those children, young man and young woman today. And I am so grateful and honored to be able to say that they are out in the world making a difference in some very big ways. And I'm proud to have played an indirect role in that as a nurturing, caring, compassionate, loving father, which I couldn't have done at one time in my life.
Anybody else want to tackle Don's question?
Thinking about that, I think that is something that is important, and something that we can present. In my work, I have worked frontline, and I haven't done any advocacy, community advocacy. Although, by joining conferences like this, and I look around across the room and we see a wide stream of all the different agencies, cultures, and coming together like this and discussing with each other, and seeking allies, not opponents, I think is very important. Often with limited resources, it's a competition of resources, and often we look at polarities, us versus them, in definites. But that's not how society is. That's not how people are. There's ranges in all societies and all people. And if we look at we're against them or they're against us, then we lose the opportunity to work together as allies, as just people. Man, woman, male, female, gender, transgender, transsexual, you name it. We're all people, and it all affects us the same way. As Rob said, everyone is affected by abuse. We may be affected different ways, but it's an evil that affects every aspect of society and every person. Even if you haven't been abused, it impacts us because we're human and we're here together. And this journey, this conference is called Healing Journeys. Journey is better together than separate. And I think as we look at each other as individuals, that's when we can work together. Every single person's journey is different. I may look the same as you, but my journey is different than yours, and your journey is different than mine. And as we look at each other as individuals in the same journey, we're looking for allies, and we're working together as allies.
I think two words come to mind with that question. Those being advocacy and accountability. So advocacy, I think, would be in the community of the individual, so the individual's immediate family. I think it's important to work, and I know it's something that team really strives to do all the time, is to advocate for the individual. And a lot of that is asking why. Why is there an expectation there from the family or wife or son and daughter for this person to be a certain way? And then the other part would be accountability of our own, pre-existing assumptions about an individual or a male, and being honest about that. I know just the other day I had a new employee come in, and he's 6'3", and he's a big man, and I'm going to hold myself accountable. Like, I completely fulfilled some gender scripts there and saying, I'm really happy I have a big, strong man at the facility to help me out. Now, that's not to say I have to then feel bad about that, but to keep myself and for everyone else to be able to keep themselves in check and hold themselves accountable when we are leaning over to that side.
I think that's a challenge that I've been thinking about, that I don't have like the solution for, but one of the things that I have been doing is in the notes we make during our conversations, I am the one holding the pen most of the times, but it's done very much in partnership, and I've also invited them, like if they want to participate more, or some people have also made their own notes in their own notebook or phone or whatever, and what we are talking about, they say, oh, like, let me write this down, because they are already engaging in initiatives like writing to people in government positions or like prime minister, stuff like that, and they're like, I want to include this in my letter, and they write it down and they take them with them. And another person also told me that the notes that he had in this person actually bought a notebook for this purpose, and this helped him support him in having conversations with his family about what we were talking about. So that has been like little initiatives that have started, but I hope we can keep working on that.
Thanks again.